Welcome to TWD Symbolism Analysis, hosted by me at TWD Music Box Mystery, also known as author Lisa K. Hill. This is where we totally geek out about the recurring symbols we see in the show, what they mean, how they connect, and what they foreshadow. So if you're a TWD geek, come over to the dark side. We have Daryl. Good morning, Team Delusional. How's everyone doing today? Well, I hope. So I was going to talk about the cure theory today. The cure theory has been around for a long time, and it's not something we've ever proven, of course, and it's something that's kind of ebbed and flowed. Like sometimes we've believed it for a long time, and then we've kind of waffled back and forth about whether we think it's still true. Overall, with what we've learned over the last couple of seasons, especially about the helicopter people, I really think that it probably is true, or at least some part of it, that, even if we're a little bit incorrect about how we're interpreting things, that we're probably barking up the right tree. So I just wanted to go over it, where it comes from, and what we think it is and why. So the cure theory says that when Beth was at Grady, Grady was working on a cure for the virus. Pretty simple, right? But there's actually a lot of evidence for this. Another way to say it would be that they were treating walker bites, which is a little bit different, but a lot of people believe that Beth was actually bitten and survived. So again, they have some way to cure it. Now, let me give a little disclaimer here. At least for me, I don't think that they actually have like a medicinal cure for the virus or like a vaccine or anything. I don't think that's really what we're looking at here. I think it's more like they've figured out some way to treat it. So the only really way that we've seen in the show to treat, quote unquote, treat a walker bite is by cutting off a limb, right? If you cut it off and the virus doesn't have much time to circulate in the system, and they can kind of prevent that, and then of course, assuming that the person doesn't die from shock, then sometimes people survive. Not always. It's very arbitrary because it's going to depend on the health of the person, how strong they are, how healthy they are, how much blood they lose, the shock factor, all of that. So it's certainly not a cure as you would normally think of it, and there's certainly no guarantees. I think that we're dealing with something more like that. Obviously, it's not hacking off limbs, but maybe a way to, give antibiotics or experimental drugs to treat the actual bacteria, maybe using something like a dialysis machine to clean the blood, something like that just cleans it. And even then, it's not going to be 100% cure. It's a way to treat it and maybe help people to survive it if the conditions are right. So we don't know exactly what that is, what they would have been using to do that, but we do have some clues. Let's start with some of the weirdnesses that we saw at Grady. Beth wakes up in the episode called Slab Town, and the first thing that's a little bit strange is that she's alone in a hospital room and the door is locked. It's odd to us that the door is locked. If she were ill and they were just waiting for her to wake up, why would they lock the door? They don't know who she is, and it could be a matter of not trusting her because she's new to their community, but it's not like they left guns and knives around for her to come stab somebody with. I mean, she took the needle out of her arm because that was the only weapon she could even think to use. And then Dawn walked in with a gun. So she's not really a big threat. I can totally understand keeping her under guard or something, but why specifically lock the door? I'll come back to why I think they did in a minute, but let's talk about some other things. Early on, it was noticed that the IV she's hooked up to has heparin in it. Now, heparin is a blood thinner, and it's actually used to treat something called deep vein thrombosis. And that's literal in our world. That's what it's used for, which is basically blood clots in the vein. So if you're somebody who has blood clots in your veins, they give you a blood thinner to try and kind of push those clots through because they're really, really painful, right? This is weird because the first thing Edwards tells her is that she had a head injury. Now, for anyone who's not particularly in the know medically about head injuries, things like concussions, the reason that they're dangerous is because when you get hit really hard in the head, you might get a bruise on the inside of your skull, right? And that's not something the doctors can always see unless they have, really sophisticated medical equipment. And it's very easy for a bruise to suddenly start bleeding inside your head. And if that happens, you will die from bleeding on the brain, right? That's what they call bleeding out of the brain. And that's why people are really, really careful about head injuries and about people who sustain them. They have to watch that person really closely over a 24 to 48 hour period to make sure that any bruise they have heals and doesn't start bleeding. Now, if a person starts bleeding, about the only way to fix it is to open up their head and fix the bleed. And more often than not, by the time they realize the person is bleeding, it's kind of too late and the person will die. I mean, it happens all the time and it's really, really sad. But the point is, you would never, ever, under any circumstances, give someone with a head injury a blood thinner, because that would encourage bleeding on the brain. If you, rather than encouraging the blood to clot at the site of the injury, it would make the blood thinner, which, I mean, basically you could kill them. And it's a major no-no. You would never give somebody with a head injury a blood thinner. Quite the opposite. You would want to give them I don't know if this really exists, but you would, if you had it, you would want to give them blood coagulants, to make sure that they didn't bleed out. So it's odd that they said she had a concussion and yet they gave her heparin. Like, those things don't jive. And before anyone suggests it, could it be a mistake? It could, but we really don't think so. Nicotero has told us more than once that they actually keep medical consultants on the show to make everything medical, including the injuries and the walker bites, as realistic as possible. So this is a huge mistake for someone who pays medical consultants to be on the show. So this was very purposeful. And then there's the fact that they didn't have to slap a heparin label on that IV. They could have just left it blank and it was like saline IV. If they're putting heparin on there, then there's a specific reason that they're putting heparin on there. Another thing that's important to note is that they have given us some evidence in the show that walker blood is like thicker and goopier, very scientific word there, than human blood. So like we actually do see it with Beth and Daryl when they're running around in inmates. Daryl can tell the difference between human blood and walker blood, and it's because walker blood kind of congeals. It's thicker, it's more purple than red, and it's like jello or something. So that's important. Again, I'll come back to that. Then we actually have a second kind of validation that something is going on with the heparin, because in that same episode in Slabtown, when they bring Joan back in, remember Joan tried to escape and they caught her and brought her back in, but she had been bitten on the arm. This was the scene where Beth had to hold her down while they cut off her arm. Edwards turns around and turns on this machine. And when I first watched it, I didn't know what this machine was. I wasn't familiar with it, but it kind of has this electronic zing when he turns it on, almost like a heart monitor machine would. But I knew it wasn't a heart machine because it was too small. This was clear back after season 5 got over. I sort of put it out to the fandom and said, hey, does anybody who's in the medical field know what this machine is? And I did get someone who answered me back, who was an RN, and she said that is a deep vein thrombosis machine. It is used to do things like administer heparin to people who have deep vein thrombosis because it breaks up blood clots. Okay, so there's something going on here about blood clots and giving them blood thinners, and understand that Edwards tried to give this treatment to Joan after she was bitten, and Beth had this treatment. So that really goes a long way towards suggesting that Beth was bitten. Some other weirdnesses. Dawn says some really strange things to Beth, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but she talks about how important what they're doing is, the work that they're doing, and tells Beth that she has the chance to be a part of something really important, and this might be the most important thing she does in her life. Okay, none of that made sense to me when I was first watching Slabtown. Okay, what kind of ego does Dawn have on her? I mean, yes, they're surviving, and of course that's important, not to downplay that, but the most important thing Beth will ever do in her life, what is she talking about? That just seems like delusions of grandeur. All you're doing is surviving in this hospital, and that's great, more power to you, but it just seems like she's talking about something else that they are not telling us as the audience. Then there's Trevitt. Trevitt is the doctor who comes in. He's the one that Dawn demands that Edwards save, and Edwards doesn't really want to, and then he has Beth give this doctor the wrong medicine later on. All right, a couple of things here. We're not really told why Dawn wants to save him so bad. You kind of have to rewatch this. There's a lot of misdirection going on here. When Trevitt is first brought in, you see O'Donnell kind of whisper something to Dawn, and I don't think we actually hear everything he says. We hear a little bit of it. Then, when she finds out whatever it was O'Donnell said to her, that's when she instantly demands that Edwards save this man, Trevitt. Not until later, the end of the episode actually, when Beth is talking to Edwards after Dawn beats her up, does he say that this man used to be an oncologist at St. Ignatius Hospital. This is a doctor, and once Dawn learned that, she really wanted to save him, but of course he did die. So we don't really understand what's going on there. We actually understand it a little better now from things we've learned recently, which I'll get into, but that was a big mystery. Like, why did she want to save Trevitt? Why did Edwards want to kill him? I mean, we're kind of given that answer in that he was afraid that Dawn would, kick him out, and he was very threatened by the idea of having another doctor there, but there's probably more to it than even that. So just a lot of strange things that everyone assumed would be explained. I remember thinking that after watching Slabtown, I was going, okay, well, they're being super mysterious right now, but eventually, Rick and Daryl will show up to get Beth, and then it'll probably explain more what's actually going on here. And it was not only was she shot, and so that I wasn't expecting that, but it never explained any of this stuff. Like, it's alluded to, but it's not explained. There's also the conversation that Dawn and Beth have where Beth is refusing to eat because she doesn't want to have to work off the resources she uses, and Dawn encourages her to eat and says, you need to heal. If you don't eat, you won't heal, and then you'll require more treatment. Okay, the writers are really sneaky about this, because on one level, it does make sense, because obviously Beth was hurt and she got treatment from the doctor. She's got the cast around her arm where apparently she had fractured her arm, arm. And, he talked about her having the concussion. So most of the audience isn't going to really question this, but it's just kind of odd to speak about it in that way. You'll require more treatment, as though it's a specific treatment. Like, why don't you just say, if you don't eat, you're going to pass out. You need to eat or you're going to get sick. But what is this more treatment thing? It sounds like a cancer treatment, or it sounds like a very specific deep vein thrombosis treatment. And it's probably what she's referring to, but they don't say that. They're being really vague and sneaky about it. One more thing we need to talk about that they're pretty vague about. We did not see what happened to Beth when she got taken by the Gradients. Everything in Alone was from Daryl's point of view. So we saw him lead the walkers into the basement. We saw him get out. We saw him run out into the yard. And by the time he got out there, Beth was already in the Grady car. So we did not see what happened there. We did not see her fight with the cops. We did not see them load her into the car, nothing. At Grady, all that we are told when Beth is speaking to Gorman in the cafeteria is that she was fighting with a walker out in the yard, and then everything went black. Okay, that's a little strange. You would think if the car drove up that she would have seen these guys get out and kill the walker, even if they were going to kidnap her, like, smack her over the head and take her. Okay, but why didn't she see them first? How did everything go black? Based on parallels and with different characters that I'm not going to get into right now, most people believe that she was hit by the car. We think the Grady cops actually smashed into her with the car. And by doing that, because she was already fighting a walker, I mean, if she passed out when the car hit her, it would have been very easy for the walker to bite her. So we think that her talking about everything going black was kind of an allusion to the fact that she was hit by the car and she was probably put into the trunk, which was very heavily foreshadowed in Still when Beth and Daryl were in the trunk. But that's kind of another discussion. The other possible evidence we have of this is that when Daryl comes out into the yard, he runs past most walkers and there aren't too many that are in his way. But right before he sees Beth's bag on the ground, he comes across one walker in particular, and there is blood all over this walker's mouth. Now, it's not uncommon for walkers to have blood on them, but this thing is like drooling massive amounts of blood. And that generally only happens right after they've fed, because they've just been eating flesh or drinking blood, right? So people see that also as evidence that, the only person this walker could have bitten is either Beth or one of the Grady cops, and we're not told that any of the Grady cops were bitten here. So we think that's when she was bitten. The idea is that she was out, she went up the road and waited for Daryl like he told her, but she came across the walker and was fighting with it, trying to kill it. And then the Grady cops hit her with the car. She was bitten. For whatever reason, they didn't kill the walker. They just picked her up, put her in the trunk, and drove away. And Daryl only saw the tail end of that. He saw them drive away. Then he came across the walker that's drooling blood and killed it. So the idea is that Beth's cast, maybe she really did fracture her arm. If you get hit by a car, very possible. But we also think that it was hiding the bite mark on her arm. You want to see some other cool evidence for this? Okay, when we're in the hallway of Grady right before Beth is shot, she runs up and hugs Noah, right? Okay, so look at this shot. You see these two holes in the sweater? They could be anything. It's true. Her sweater could just be torn. No one's clothes stay very nice when, in the show. But now look at this picture. This is from 6A when the group is conducting Operation Lead the Walkers Away, and they meet David and Betsy, which we always thought were kind of a parallel for Daryl and Beth. The letters of their names are the same. And Betsy commits suicide at some point, and David is bitten. But if you look at this shot, this is when Michonne looks at his bite, it looks exactly the same. In a way, it's almost like vampire teeth, which I think is kind of funny. It's just the way that they're showing a bite mark in clothing. But I think it's supposed to be a parallel, guys. Beth had this exact same thing in her sweater. So the point is, if these two holes in David's shirt were caused by a walker bite, then the two holes in Beth's sweater, which is on the arm near where her cast would have been, were also caused by a walker bite. So what does it all mean? Chances are her door was locked at the beginning of Slabtown because they didn't know whether the treatment would work or not. They didn't know if she was going to survive, and if she didn't, she would have turned into a walker. So compare that to episode 402 at the prison after Patrick changed into a walker. Because there were no doors on any of the cells, everyone just kind of had sheets and blankets for privacy. He just walked around and started eating people. I think Carol said it when the council was talking about it after that. She said, it's not just the virus. People die, they become a threat because they turn into walkers and start munching on everyone, right? So I think that's why her door was locked and there was no one in there. That was the safest way to do it until they were sure that the treatment would work and she wouldn't turn into a walker. The heparin is because she was bitten. And I think when the virus circulates in somebody's blood, it actually congeals their blood and probably very much contributes to their death. So in order to stave that off, to try and save her or anyone who's bitten, they give them blood thinners to, make sure that blood doesn't congeal and clot in a way that would cause their death. So that's why they tried to give the heparin through the thrombosis machine to Joan when she was bitten. They immediately had to treat her with that, right? And she refused and said no, because she just was sick of being there and didn't want their treatment. And so Dawn was not going to allow that. She was not going to allow Joan to die because she wasn't going to allow her to have that choice. So they cut off her arm instead. All right. The rest of it gets into stuff that we did not learn until about this last season or two. And a lot of it comes from Fear the Walking Dead. It has to do with the helicopter people. In Fear the Walking Dead, one of the characters named Al meets one of the helicopter people. Her name was Isabel, and they actually have a bit of a relationship. And we learn that the helicopter people are purifying water. And we're not sure exactly what that's leading to, but it's probably important. Maybe at some point the water is going to become undrinkable and everyone is going to need water and only the helicopter people will have it. The thing is, the helicopter people are somewhat military in the way they conduct themselves. So there's a lot of theories that this is actually the US government or what's left of it, or the military, or some, it could be more of a privatized military group. We're not sure, but they have helicopters, they have uniforms, they have guns. I mean, they seem like they're really well organized. And so it would make sense that they're working on a cure of some kind. We also know that they're very secretive. Once somebody finds out about them, they don't let that person leave again ever, because they're just afraid of other people who are, other survivors in the world sort of storming their operation, and they feel like they are rebuilding the world for mankind. So they're obviously not concerned about saving individuals, which makes them not the most moral group ever. So my theory is this: the people at Grady are actually part of the helicopter group. Now, we didn't ever hear them say that, and so it is conjecture, but we have some evidence. Number one, there was a helicopter pad on the roof of Grady, and they made sure to show us that, even though we never actually saw any helicopters. Then there's this interesting little conversation that Beth and Dawn have. Dawn keeps telling her that they need to keep surviving and do what they got to do, even if it means, letting some of the Grady cops rape people. Like, she's willing to do that just so that they make it and stay alive until rescue comes. And Beth gets after her and yells at her and says, nobody's coming. Nobody's coming to rescue us. Why do you think that? And again, this is the writers being really sneaky, because nobody really questioned that. I mean, Dawn was shown as enough of a terrible leader and had enough of an ego that she, it was believable that she would believe that and be deluding herself about that. But my biggest takeaway, which I didn't have until after we learned about the helicopter group in Fear the Walking Dead, is that Dawn doesn't actually argue back with Beth. She doesn't actually say anything. So it kind of sounds like she might be agreeing with what Beth is saying about no one coming, and she's just angry about it. Like, she's just in denial about it. But my question is, why does she believe that to begin with? It's not a very logical thing to believe. And yeah, maybe there's some ego there, but there's got to be some reason that she believes it. And she never explains why she believes it. So I think she was in contact with the helicopter group, and they had told her at some point they would come rescue the people who were living there, and she was just waiting for them to do that. So when Beth says no one's coming, what if she was wrong? There really was someone coming, the helicopter group, and they really were in communication with this group. There are other theories around this helicopter group. There's quite a lot of them. It also has a lot to do with radiation, and we're not sure how it all connects, but that actually probably would explain Trevitt, because he was an oncology doctor, which is someone who deals with cancer and therefore administers chemo and other forms of radiation to cancer patients, right? Okay, so that could be why Dawn wanted him so badly, because he is an expert at radiation, and if they're using radiation to treat the walker bites in some way, he would have been a huge asset to their group. Meanwhile, Edwards was really threatened by him and got rid of him, basically. And according to Edwards, he might not have been able to be saved anyway because he had internal bleeding. The point is, Dawn wanted him because of the radiation angle. Now you can skip to where we are currently in season 10, and we have Ezekiel with this strange, possibly cancer growth on his neck. We don't really know if it's cancerous or yet, but he believes it is. And we're pretty sure we're about to come into contact with the helicopter group in some way. And when we do, they might have a way to treat his cancer. So it's just kind of interesting. All the pieces are starting to connect in a way that they haven't before over the last season or two. And it's making some of the things that happened at Grady a little more clear. We still don't know for sure exactly what they all mean or how they all connect, but it's kind of starting to make sense. So I think this is most of it. Again, we think that Beth was bitten and she was treated possibly with radiation. And, that's what a lot of this stuff was about. If they were working on a cure, that's why Dawn was talking about it being the most important thing she'll do in her life. The helicopter group believes they're saving the world for future generations. That's why it's important. It's more important than one person. Dawn said the whole thing about how they had to do things for the greater good, and a single person such as Beth was not the greater good. If you kind of look at everything that was said in the context of the helicopter group and maybe what they were trying to accomplish, it just makes a lot more sense. All right, I'm going to stop there. This video is running long, but that is the cure theory. Of course, it is just a theory. We don't know for sure that that is the case, but I personally believe that it is. And even if we're wrong about some of the details or the way it plays out is a little bit different than what I've laid out here, I can definitely see that happening, but I still think that all of this means something and that we're, getting the basic gist of what it is, just not necessarily all the details. So let me know what you guys think about that. How do you feel about the cure theory? And do you interpret any of this any other way? I would love to hear. See you in the next video.